You've likely pictured monks as serene figures, living lives of blissful solitude, untouched by the world's chaos. Think again. Tonight we are pulling back the veil on the surprising truth. Medieval monasteries were often hotbeds of human conflict. From property disputes to power struggles that would shock you, this isn't the quiet bedtime story you're expecting. Close your eyes and imagine the stone walls of a 12th century abbey. You probably see soft candlelight and hear the faint, melodic hum of Gregorian chants. But if you were to actually step into those shadows, the first thing you'd notice wouldn't be the peace, it would be the tension. The great silence was the rule, yes, but silence has a way of magnifying the smallest irritations until they roar. Imagine living, eating, and praying in the same room with the same 40 men for 40 years. No vacations, no personal time, just the constant rhythmic sound of Brother Thomas's heavy breathing during the midnight vigils, or the way Brother Bernard always seemed to take the best piece of bread at the midday meal. In the American psyche, we value our personal space. In a medieval monastery, that concept didn't exist. These were men from all walks of life, from our soldiers with PTSD, younger sons of noblemen who were forced into the church against their will, and peasants seeking a meal. They were packed together like sardines in a stone can. The communal dormitory wasn't a place of rest. It was a theater of petty feuds. A misplaced sandal or a cough during the Lectio Divina wasn't just a minor annoyance. It was a spark. When you are forbidden from speaking, your eyes do the talking. Sharp glares across the refectory table became the primary language of the cloister. We often think of these men as saints in waiting, but they were humans first. And humans, when trapped in a cycle of rigid routine and forced proximity, tend to find reasons to resent one another. The serenity of the monastery was often just a thin veneer covering a boiling pot of suppressed frustration. In the whispered shadows of the abbey, there was a secret that no one dared to speak aloud. The path to heaven was often blocked by the egos of men. We like to imagine the monastery as a flat landscape of equality, where every monk was a brother and every brother was equal. But the truth of the medieval monastery was far more corporate, far more rigid, and infinitely more frustrating. The hierarchy was the skeleton of the monastery, and like any skeleton, it could be brittle and prone to breaking. At the top sat the abbot. In the eyes of the law and the church, he was the father, the absolute monarch of this small, walled universe. Beneath him was the prior, the enforcer of rules. And then a series of officers, known as obedientaries, the cellarer, who controlled the food, the sacrist, and the cantor. At the bottom, the novices and the lay brothers, the men who did the heavy lifting.
Watch the plowing
and the cleaning, often with little hope of ever rising to the status of a choir monk. In the American workplace today, we talk about office politics. In the 13th century, monastic politics were a matter of spiritual life and death. Imagine being a man of high birth, perhaps the third son of a duke, who joined the order expecting to be fast-tracked to leadership, only to find himself taking orders from a prior who was the son of a tanner. The resentment didn't just simmer, it curdled. This hierarchy created a breeding ground for a very specific kind of human poison, passive aggression. Because the rule of Saint Benedict demanded humility and obedience. You couldn't simply scream at a superior who treated you unfairly. Instead, you fought with silence. You fought with the way you bowed, just a fraction of an inch less than required. You fought by forgetting to ring the bells at the precise moment, forcing the abbot to wait in the cold chapel, his breath misting in the air, wondering why the world was out of sync. The pecking order wasn't just about titles. It was about resources. The best seat near the fire in the calefactory, the warming room during a brutal winter, was unassigned by need. It was assigned by seniority. If you were a young monk with frostbitten fingers, you stayed in the shadows, while the elders basked in the glow. You watched them, their faces orange in the firelight, and you felt a coldness in your heart that had nothing to do with the weather outside. In this high-pressure environment, the chapter of faults became a weapon. Every day, the monks gathered in the chapter house. It was a time for confession, but it was also a time for proclamation. This meant one monk could stand up and publicly accuse another of a mistake. I proclaim Brother Julian for dropping a ceramic bowl in the refectory, one might say, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. On the surface, it was about maintaining discipline. In reality, it was often about settling scores. Did Brother Julian snub you yesterday? Did he take the better quill in the scriptorium? Now was your chance for revenge. The consequences weren't just a slap on the wrist. For a major fault, a monk could be excommunicated from the communal life, forced to eat alone on the floor, forbidden from entering the church, and treated as a ghost by his peers. Imagine the psychological toll, to be cancelled in a community of only 50 people, where those 50 people are the only world you will ever know. The silence of the monastery was no longer a tool for prayer. It was a cage. We often hear the phrase, "the devil is in the details." For the medieval monk, the devil was in the monotony. The American spirit is built on the idea of progress, of moving forward, the next big thing. But monastic life was circular. It's the same prayers at 2 a.m., the same soup at noon, the same psalms at sunset. For some, this routine was a ladder to the divine. For many others, it was a grinding stone that wore down their sanity. When your entire world is reduced to a 300-yard square of stone and grass, the smallest things become mountains. The way a brother chewed his food, the way another whistled through his teeth, the way the cantor led the chant just a half step too fast, ruining the perfection of the moment. These weren't just petty feuds. They were the desperate gasps of individuals trying to maintain a sense of self in a system designed to erase the individual. The monastery was a pressure cooker with no safety valve. And as we will see, when that pressure built up too high, it didn't just result in broken bowls or missed prayers. It resulted in full-scale rebellions that reached the ears of kings. Step out of the drafty dormitories and into the abbot's parlor. Here the air smells of expensive beeswax and imported wine, far removed from the watery cabbage and stale incense of the common monk. If the lower monks were fighting over bread crusts and breathing patterns, the men at the top were playing a game of thrones that would make a modern politician blush. In the medieval world, an abbey wasn't just a church, it was a corporation. It owned thousands of acres of land, controlled entire villages, and commanded massive wealth. This turned the election of an abbot from a spiritual selection into a high-stakes corporate takeover. Imagine the scene. The old abbot has died. The body is barely cold in the crypt before the whispering begins in the cloisters. There are two factions. One wants a reformer, someone who will bring back the strict ancient rules and cut out the luxuries. The other wants a manager, someone who will keep the wine flowing and the secular lords happy. In these moments, the whispered history takes a dark turn. We have records of monks hiding the monastery's official seal so the opposing faction couldn't finalize an election. We have stories of midnight councils where promises of better food or lighter chores were traded for votes. It wasn't about who was the holiest. It was about who could maintain the status quo or provide the most leverage. Once an abbot was elected, the struggle didn't end. A disgruntled prior, the second in command, could make an abbot's life a living hell. If the prior felt passed over for the top job, he might lead a shadow government, encouraging the monks to ignore the abbot's commands, or worse, sending secret letters to the bishop, alleging moral failings in the abbot's private chambers. The monastery, intended to be a lighthouse of divine order, often functioned more like a snake pit of ambition. But the drama wasn't confined within the stone walls. The monastery was a golden goose, and every secular lord and bishop in the region wanted a piece of it. In America, we value the separation of church and state. In the Middle Ages, that line was a blurry, bloody mess. A local baron might have donated the land the monastery sat on 100 years ago. Now, his descendant, a man with a gambling debt and a short temper, decides he wants that land back. Or, he demands that his unfit son be given a high-ranking position in the monastery. Regardless of the boy's lack of faith, if the abbot said no, the lord might send his men to harass the monastery, as tenant farmers, or block the roads where the monk's wool was sent to market. The monks weren't just praying for souls. They were constantly negotiating with the wolves at the gate. They were lobbyists. Lawyers and estate managers dressed in robes but acting like CEOs. Perhaps the most surprising conflict wasn't between the monks and the world, but between the monks and each other. Think of it like a brand war. You had the Benedictines, the black monks, who were the established, wealthy elite. Then came the Cistercians, the white monks, who claimed the black monks had grown fat and lazy. The Cistercians built their abbeys in the wilderness, claiming a purer way of life. But purity is a competitive business. These orders fought over everything. Tithes, who had the right to collect taxes from the local peasants. Recruitment, who was getting the best novices from the noble families. prestige, whose relics were more miraculous. There are documented cases of monks from rival orders literally coming to blows in the streets of medieval towns over rights to a marketplace. They would use their staves meant for walking to crack the skulls of their brothers in Christ. The competition was fierce because, in their minds, there was only so much holiness and money to go around. The peace of the monastery was a hard-won political truce, constantly under threat from the ego of the man wearing the mitre and the greed of the man wearing the crown. While the abbots played their games of power and the monks bickered over bread, a much quieter, more terrifying war was being waged in the dark corners of the cells. This was the war of the mind. The Middle Ages, they had a name for it, axidy or acedia. They called it the noonday demon. It wasn't just boredom, it was a soul-crushing spiritual apathy. Imagine waking up at 3 a.m. for the 10th year in a row. The stone floor is ice-cold beneath your feet. Your bones ache from the dampness of the abbey. You stand in the choir, mouthing the words to a psalm you've recited 5,000 times. And suddenly, a thought strikes you like a bolt of lightning. What if none of this matters? The American dream is built on the concept of reinvention. If you don't like your job, you quit. If you don't like your city, you move. But for the medieval monk, there was no reset button. You took a vow of stability. That meant you promised to die in the same monastery where you started. This lifelong commitment became a psychological backpack filled with stones. For many, the monastery wasn't a sanctuary. It was a slow-motion prison. As the years turned into decades, the walls seemed to move closer. The whispered history is full of accounts of monks who simply snapped. Some fled into the woods, becoming vagabond monks hunted by the church. Others fell into a deep clinical depression that the medieval world had no name for, other than sin. Then there was the struggle with temptation. We often talk about sins of the flesh in a hushed, scandalous way. But for a young man in his 20s, living in a dormitory, the struggle was constant and agonizing. They were told that even a wandering thought was a betrayal of Christ. To combat these thoughts, monks practiced mortification. They would wear hair shirts, undershirts made of coarse animal hair, that irritated the skin until it bled to remind them of the suffering of Jesus. They would fast, till their heads lightened and they hallucinated. But the human heart is stubborn. The more they tried to suppress their humanity, the more it leaked out in the form of anger, jealousy, or secret, forbidden friendships. Perhaps the most whispered truth of all is that many monks stopped believing. In a world where the church was the only explanation for the universe, admitting you had lost your faith was equivalent to admitting you were a monster. Imagine the spiritual turmoil of a monk who no longer feels the presence of God but must still lead the prayers for the local villagers. He becomes an actor in a play that never ends. He watches his brothers weep in ecstasy during the Eucharist, and he feels nothing but the hunger in his stomach and the itch of his wool robe. This internal existential crisis created a unique kind of monastic friction. A monk who is doubting his faith is often the one who is most critical of his brothers. He lashes out at the hypocrisy he sees around him because it mirrors the emptiness he feels inside. The monastery was meant to be a laboratory for the soul, a place to distill human nature into something divine. But often the heat of the crucible didn't purify the metal, it just made it brittle. The monks weren't just fighting the abbot or the neighboring lord. Were fighting the very nature of their own humanity. We have walked through the drafty corridors, felt the sting of the chapter of faults, and sat in the suffocating silence of a faith in crisis. Now we must ask the most important question of all. Why? Why do we, centuries later, still cling to the image of the serene, silent monk? Why does the American imagination, so obsessed with noise, speed, and the hustle, look back at the medieval monastery as a lost paradise of peace? The myth of the peaceful monk persists because we need it to be true. In our modern world of constant notifications and 24/7 connectivity, the idea of a stone-walled sanctuary where the world's chaos cannot reach is deeply seductive. We want to believe that there is a way to opt out of human drama, but as we've discovered, you can leave the world, but you cannot leave yourself. You can lock the heavy oak doors of the abbey, but you are locking your ego, your temper, your history inside with you. The serenity we see in historical paintings is a curated image, the 14th century version of an Instagram filter. The monks themselves promoted this image to attract donors and maintain their status as the spiritual frontline of society. When we strip away the myth, what we find is something far more relatable than a saint. We find a human being. The fact that these men struggled with noisy roommates, unfair bosses, and spiritual burnout doesn't make their history lesser, it makes it ours. There is something profoundly moving about a monk in 1280 AD who's frustrated because the brother next to him keeps tapping his foot during the Magnificat. It bridges the gap of centuries. We realize that the quest for a better life, a higher life, has always been messy. These struggles make the human story of the monastery a mirror. When we see their property disputes or power struggles, we aren't just looking at dusty records. We're looking at the eternal human struggle to live in community. How do we get along with people we didn't choose? How do we stay committed to a goal when the noonday demon of boredom sets in? The monastery wasn't a haven, it was a crucible. Crucible is a container used to melt metal at extremely high temperatures to remove impurities. It isn't a peaceful place. It's a place of intense heat, pressure, and chemical reactions. Some monks were refined by that heat, emerging with a genuine, quiet strength. Others were cracked by it. But the story of the monastery is the story of the fire itself. It is the story of men trying, failing, and trying again to be something better than their basic instincts. If you want to understand why the blissful solitude of the monastery was so often interrupted by the clatter of swords and the scratching of legal quills, you have to look at the ledgers. We tend to think of medieval monks as men who lived on air and prayer. But by the 13th century, monasteries were the economic engines of Europe. They were the Silicon Valley and the Wall Street of the Middle Ages rolled into one. And that much wealth inevitably brought the world's chaos right to their doorstep. Imagine a monastery like Fountains Abbey or Cluny. These weren't just churches, they were massive industrial complexes. The monks were the first to implement industrial-scale farming. They were the masters of hydraulic engineering, diverting rivers to power mills and irrigate fields. In England, the Cistercians became the wool kings. They owned tens of thousands of sheep, and their wool was the highest quality in the world, exported to the great weaving houses of Flanders and Italy. But here's the whispered truth. You cannot be a global wool tycoon and a humble hermit at the same time. The corporate monks spent more time discussing market prices, export taxes, and shipping routes than he did meditating on the Gospels. The cellarer of the monk in charge of the monastery's provisions was essentially a chief financial officer. He was constantly traveling, meeting with merchants in crowded, noisy ports, haggling over the price of a sack of grain. As the gold piled up, the simple life began to erode. Wealth changed the architecture of the soul. The original rule of St. Benedict was clear. Monks should live by the work of their own hands. But when you own 20 villages and 5,000 sheep, you don't plow the fields yourself, you hire peasants to do it. This created a class divide within the monastery walls. The choir monks, the literate noble-born men, became a sort of spiritual middle management. While the lay brothers did the manual labor, this led to a toxic dynamic. The lay brothers often felt like second-class citizens, worked to the bone while the choir monks spent their days in the scriptorium or the chapel. We have records of lay brother revolts where the workers went on strike, refusing to provide food to the monks until their own rations were improved. It was a medieval labor union dispute played out in the name of God. Another source of constant friction was the rule S, man to welcome every guest as if they were Christ himself. In theory, this was beautiful. In practice, it was an unfunded mandate that nearly bankrolled many abbeys. Because monasteries were the only hotels on the road, they were forced to host everyone from weary pilgrims to the king himself. And when a king traveled, he didn't come alone. He brought a retinue of hundreds of soldiers, horses, and servants. They would stay for weeks, eating the monastery's best food, drinking the finest ale, and leaving the monks with a massive bill and a depleted larder. The monks had to choose, turn away the king and risk his wrath, or feed the king and let their own brothers go hungry. This hospitality often turned into a resentment-filled obligation. The serene cloister was frequently crowded with the king's rowdy soldiers, who would gamble in the garth and whistle at the novices, shattering the silence the monks worked so hard to maintain. When the wool trade wasn't enough, the monasteries turned to the relic economy. Every monastery wanted a superstar relic, a piece of the true cross, the bone of a famous saint, or a vial of holy oil. Why? Because relics brought pilgrims, and pilgrims brought donations. This led to what we can only call relic wars. Monasteries would sue each other over who had the real finger of St. John. There are even accounts of holy theft, where monks from one abbey would break into another to steal a prestigious corpse, believing that the saint wanted to be moved to a wealthier home. In the American mindset, we call this branding. In the medieval world, it was a desperate scramble for survival. Easy. The monks weren't just praying for your soul, they were competing for your tourist dollars. If you were to walk through the ruins of a medieval abbey today, you would see crumbling arches and peaceful ivy. You would hear the wind whistling through empty window frames. It feels like a place where violence could never exist. But if the stones could talk, they wouldn't just whisper prayers, they would scream. In the American tradition, we view the church as a sanctuary, a place where the rules of the violent world stop at the door. But in the Middle Ages, the monastery was often the target, and sometimes the source, of brutal physical conflict. When the hotbeds of human conflict mentioned in our hook reached a breaking point, the result wasn't a sternly worded letter. It was blood on the flagstones. One of the most shocking examples of this occurred at St. Albans Abbey in England. The monks there weren't just spiritual leaders. They were landlords who held a monopoly on the town's grain mills. The townspeople were forbidden from using their own hand mills to grind corn. They had to pay the monks for the privilege. In 1381, during the Peasants' Revolt, the tension snapped. A mob of townspeople marched on the serene abbey. They didn't come to pray. They broke down the great gate, stormed the cloisters, and reclaimed the ancient millstones that the monks had confiscated and used as paving stones to mock the town's poverty. The monks, far from being untouched by the world's chaos, had to barricade themselves in the church. Listening as the crowd destroyed their legal records and threatened their lives, this wasn't a bedtime story. It was a class war fought at the altar, but the violence wasn't always external. Sometimes the monks were the aggressors. We have records from the 14th century of apostate monks, men who had fled their vows and formed bands of outlaws. Because they were often younger sons of noblemen, they knew how to fight. Even within the walls, the pecking order we discussed in Part 2 could turn lethal. In the Abbey of Malmesbury, a monk named William of Collarn was so hated by his brothers for his tyrannical rule as abbot that they allegedly attempted to poison him. When that failed, the atmosphere within the cloister became one of a cold war, where the abbot traveled with armed guards of armed Cardisfin to the midnight services fearing that one of his brothers would slip a dagger between his ribs in the dark. We cannot talk about monastic violence without mentioning the Northmen. For a USA audience raised on shows like Vikings, the raid on Lindisfarne in 793 AD is the ultimate symbol of chaos, but look at it from the monk-s perspective. You are in a place specifically designed to be the safest, holiest spot on earth, and suddenly, men who do not fear your God are hacking down the doors. These raids force the monks to become something they never intended to be: fortress commanders. They built round towers, stone cylinders with doors 10 feet off the ground where they would scramble with their relics and gold, while the monastery burned below. The peaceful life was replaced by a state of constant high-alert anxiety. Every sail on the horizon was a potential death sentence. Finally, there was the legalized violence of the rule itself. Corporal punishment was a standard part of monastic life. If a monk committed a major fault, the abbot could order him to be whipped in front of the entire community in the chapter house. Imagine the psychological impact. Standing in a circle of your peers, the men you eat and pray with, while you are stripped and beaten for a mistake, like losing a library book or speaking after Compline. This wasn't blissful solitude. It was a regime of fear. The silence of the monastery was often maintained not by devotion, but by the threat of the lash. The monastery was a crucible, yes, but sometimes the fire was literal. The surprising truth is that these men lived on the edge of a knife. Their lives were a constant negotiation between the peace they promised to God and the violence they inherited from a brutal world. If the chapter house was the courtroom of the monastery and the refectory was its dining hall, then the scriptorium was its brain. In our modern high-speed digital age, we take the written word for granted. But for the medieval monk, books were the most precious objects on earth. A single Bible could cost as much as a farm. In the American imagination, We see the scriptorium as a place of Zen-like focus, monks sitting in pools of golden sunlight, peacefully illuminating manuscripts with gold leaf. But the reality was a grueling, bone-chilling marathon. It was here, in the quiet scratching of quills on vellum, that the monks' suppressed humanity bled onto the page in the most literal sense. Imagine sitting on a hard wooden bench for 6 to 8 hours a day in a room with no heating. It's February. Your fingers are so numb you can barely grip the goose feather quill. Your back is a knot of spasms because you've re-hunched over a desk designed for a man half your size, and you cannot speak. You cannot complain. You must simply copy, letter by letter, for months on end. The monks didn't just feel the spiritual weight of the words, they felt the physical toll. We know this because of the colophons, the exit notes monks wrote at the very end of a book. One monk wrote, "Now I've finished this, for God's sake, give me a drink." Another added, "The parchment is hairy." Or simply, "Writing is excessive drudgery. It curves your back, dims your eyes, and twists your stomach." These weren't the words of serene figures. These were the words of exhausted laborers. The whispered history is hidden in these margins, revealing that the monks viewed their holy work with the same Monday morning dread that many of us feel today. Perhaps the most delightful and shocking evidence of monastic conflict is found in marginalia, the doodles drawn in the borders of prayer books. When the abbot wasn't looking, the monks' pent-up frustrations and weird humor exploded into ink. In the margins of the holiest texts, we find bizarre images: snails fighting knights, rabbits officiating at funerals, and caricatures of authority figures. Why? Because when you are forced to be serene 24 hours a day, your brain creates its own chaos to survive. These doodles were a form of silent defiance. They were a way for a monk to say, "I am still here. I am an individual. I have a sense of humor that this stone wall hasn't crushed yet." The scriptorium was also the site of an intellectual power struggle. In the Middle Ages, knowledge was power. If a monastery had a rare book on medicine, law, or philosophy, they guarded it like a state secret. This led to book theft, which the church considered a sin nearly as bad as murder. To prevent it, monks didn't just lock their libraries. They chained the books to the desks. They also wrote book curses on the first page. And one famous curse read, "If anyone take away this book, let him die the death. Let him be fried in a pan. The falling sickness and fever seize him. Let him be broken on the wheel and hanged." Amen. This doesn't sound like a quiet bedtime story, does it? It sounds like a desperate, territorial battle over the control of information. The monastery wasn't just a place of prayer, it was a vault. And the monks were the suspicious, overworked guards of the Western world's intellectual treasures. Finally, we have to address the fake news of the medieval world. Monks were the keepers of history, which meant they could change history. If a rival monastery claimed a certain piece of land, a monk in the scriptorium might accidentally discover an ancient document which he had just forged, proving his own abbey owned it. These pious frauds were common. In the pursuit of their monastery's survival, monks would lie, forge, and rewrite the past. The Serenity of the monastery was built on a foundation of carefully crafted narratives, proving that even in a house of God, the truth was often a casualty of the power struggles mentioned in our hook. The sun has set over the abbey, and the great silence has descended. To the outside world, this was the hour of deepest sanctity. But as the shadows lengthened in the cloisters, a different kind of life began, the shadow life. If the day belonged to the rule of Saint Benedict, the night often belonged to the ghosts of the men who couldn't quite kill the human being inside the monk. In the whispered history of the cloister, the cellar wasn't just a place for storing barrels. It was the heart of the monastery's secret world. It was where the pressure of the lifelong commitment finally found its safety valve. In the Middle Ages, water was often dangerous to drink, but ale and wine were seen as gifts from God. However, for a monk, moderation was the law. The rule dictated exactly how much a monk could drink, usually a hymena or about half a pint a day. But when you are cold, exhausted, and living in a state of constant social friction, half a pint is rarely enough. The cellarer was often the most popular man in the monastery, not because of his holiness, but because he held the keys to the heavy oak doors of the buttery. We have records of secret drinking societies within the walls, groups of monks who would slip away after the night office of matins to share a forbidden cask. In the darkness of the cellar, the hierarchy dissolved. For an hour, they weren't brother or prior. They were just men, venting their frustrations, mocking the abbot's snooty Latin, and drowning the noonday demon in a cup of fermented grain. Humans are social creatures. We're hardwired for intimacy, touch, and deep connection. But the monastery was designed to break those wires. The rule warned against particular friendships, what they called amicita specialists. The fear was that if two monks became too close, their loyalty to each other would surpass their loyalty to God and the community. Imagine the psychological torture of finding a best friend or a soulmate in a place where you are forbidden to speak to them privately. The whispered history is filled with the tragedy of these suppressed bonds. Monks developed complex systems of hand signals and medieval sign language, just to ask for salt at dinner, but to check in on a friend's well-being. When these relationships were discovered, the major consequences were brutal. A monk could be moved to a distant cell or forbidden from ever looking at his friend again. This wasn't just a property dispute over a soul. It was the systematic dismantling of the human heart in the name of spiritual purity. Not everyone could stay. In the American ethos, quitting is a right. In the medieval monastery, leaving was apostasy. If a monk climbed over the wall and ran, he became a ghost, a man without a legal identity, a fugitive from God. But they did run. Some ran because of a loss of faith, others because of a debt they couldn't pay, and many simply because they missed the world. These vagabond monks were the scandal of the Middle Ages. They would wander from town to town, using their literacy to con people, or joining bands of mercenaries. The church would hire bounty hunters to find them and bring them back to the monastery in chains. When an apostate was caught and returned, he was often kept in a vade and pace go in peace, a euphemism for a solitary confinement cell in the basement. He became a literal ghost within the house. His muffled cries a constant reminder to the other brothers of the surprising truth. The monastery was a fortress you couldn't leave, even if the enemy was inside your own mind. We must also address the most whispered secret of all, the nepotism of the heart. While many monks remained celibate, the records of the Visitation Church audits tell a different story. Bishops would frequently discover that monks had housekeepers in the local village, or that the abbot was funneling monastery funds to support children he wasn't supposed to have. This wasn't just about sin. It was about the impossible struggle of the human animal against a rigid, artificial system. Every time a monk broke his vow of chastity, he wasn't just committing a religious offense. He was engaging in a desperate, reckless act of rebellion against the blissful solitude that felt more like a burial. The monastery was a place of high ideals, but those ideals were lived by men with low instincts. The shadow life was where those two worlds collided, creating a history that is messy, tragic, and deeply undeniably human. The candles have burned down to stubs, and the dawn light is beginning to gray the edges of the high arched windows. We have journeyed through the petty bickering of the dormitories, the high-stakes politics of the abbot's parlor, the bloodied gates of rebellion, and the secret, ink-stained rebellions of the scriptorium. We have seen the whispered truth that the medieval monastery was never a stagnant pond of peace, but a rushing river of human ambition, fear, and resilience. Now, as we conclude this tale, we must ask, what do we do with this unquiet history? For centuries, we have sanitized the monastery. We have turned it into a postcard of tranquility, a place where men with soft hands and softer hearts lived untouched by the world's chaos. But in doing so, we have actually done the monks a disservice. We have turned them into two-dimensional saints, stripping away the very things that made their lives meaningful, their struggles. If we view the monastery as a perfect haven, it remains a distant alien thing. But if we view it as a crucible of human experience, it becomes a story we can finally relate to. A crucible is not a place where you go to be comfortable. It is a place where you go to be changed. The heat of that change comes precisely from the hotbeds of conflict we've explored. The monk who had to share a cell with a man he detested was unfailing at his vows. He was living the most difficult part of them. The abbot, who had to navigate the greed of local lords, wasn't corrupting the monastery. He was protecting his community in a violent world. These conflicts weren't interruptions to their spiritual lives, they were their spiritual lives. The American audience, perhaps more than any other, is haunted by the myth of the clean break. We love the idea of moving to the mountains, deleting our social media, and finding inner peace. We think that if we just change our location, we can change our nature.
Damn.
The history of the medieval monastery is a gentle, whispered warning that there is no such thing as a clean break. You can change your clothes, your name, and your daily schedule, but the human story follows you. The serenity we crave isn't found by escaping conflict, but by learning how to live within it. The monks didn't find peace because the monastery was quiet. They found it when they did by navigating the noise with grace. By reclaiming the messy, petty, and political reality of monastic life, we make history come alive. We realize that the monk in 1340 who was frustrated by his office politics is our brother. The novice who doubted his purpose in the middle of a cold night is our neighbor. When we see the monastery as a collection of humans vulnerable, flawed, and occasionally brilliant, we see a reflection of our own world. We realize that we don't need a perfect haven to find meaning. We just need the courage to stay in the crucible. The enduring appeal of the monastery isn't that it was a place where nothing happened. It's that it was a place where everything happened, the best and worst of humanity, contained within 4 stone walls and dedicated to something higher than the self. Tonight, as you think back on these whispered history tales, don't remember the monks as silent statues. Remember them as the rowdy, tired, brilliant, and frustrated men they were. See the monastery not as a museum of dead traditions, but as a living laboratory of the heart. The surprising truth is that their struggles don't make them less holy. They make them more real. And in that reality, there is a far deeper beauty than any quiet bedtime story could ever provide. The veil has been pulled back. The bells are ringing for the morning service. And the human story, in all its chaotic, conflicted, and magnificent glory, continues.